I walked up to the special party where my wife was with her lover and saw her kissing him, and the whole room seemed to spin around me. I didn't make a scene, just stared at her for a second and left without looking back. "Take good care of what's left, because there's nothing left of us," I muttered as I left. She came after me 2 days later. Crying, sobbing, saying it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, that she was confused, that I no longer hurt her, that she felt alone, invisible. But I hadn't been deaf or blind these past few months, I was just trying to save what we had. She wasn't. She was searching for another body, another lap, another mouth, for what I still held tightly in my hands. And the cruelest thing was realizing she had already left me long before she betrayed me, she just hadn't had the courage to tell me. And when everything that still existed in me that believed in us died that night, she decided to back out. Too late. When I left that party, I didn't just leave her life. I left an entire world I'd built over years. I left myself. Everything I believed was indestructible. The pain was physical. A hole in my chest. A dull emptiness. An absence that screamed. I left with the strange certainty that something inside me had been murdered without a sound, without any apology that could suffice. And as much as she swore that kiss was nothing more than a slip of the tongue, I knew right then and there, when respect is gone, no love can withstand it. And respect had long since disappeared, I just didn't want to see it. For years, I was the kind of man who believed that love endured everything. That all it took was loving hard enough for everything to fall into place. And perhaps that's why I endured so much. Her absences. Her silences. Her flimsy justifications. Her empty smiles. Her lame excuses for not touching, not looking, not talking. I loved for 4 months. Until I understood that love isn't about desperate effort. Love is exchange. And she had stopped choosing me a long time ago. I didn't make a scene because there was no point in fighting for something I no longer recognized. I left without looking back because, if I had, perhaps my weakest part would have begged to stay. And I couldn't allow that. I deserved more than begging for crumbs of affection. And when she tried to explain, when she tried to recover, all I could see was the version of her that betrayed me without remorse until she was caught. The problem was never the kiss. It was everything that came before it. The coldness, the lies, the cowardice. The kiss was just the final proof that what I loved no longer existed. She told me he didn't want anything serious. That he'd made a mistake. That he'd let himself be carried away by neediness and vanity. That the emptiness grew even greater after I left. That I was the only man who looked at her with true admiration. That she missed me in the little things, in the light on the lamp when she slept, in the coffee I left ready every Sunday, in the way I kept quiet when she needed silence and the way I spoke when she needed direction. She remembered everything, except the exact moment she chose to hurt me. Because the truth is, she didn't slip. She went. Willingly. With desire. With choice. And perhaps the most painful thing was realizing that, even though I regretted every step I took toward that relationship, I still would have tried to save it if she had told me the truth sooner. But she only confessed when she could no longer hide it. When the world spun around me and everything came to a head at a party I never should have attended. They invited me out of politeness. And she clearly didn't expect me to go. Not with him there. Not with that dress. Not with that kiss. But I went. And fate made sure I arrived at just the right moment. That kiss wasn't an oversight. It was a sentence. It was confirmation of what my intuition had been whispering for months, and which I refused to listen to. I stared at her. Not with hate. Not with anger. With the silence of someone who finally understood they'd already lost. And when I told her to take good care of what's left, I was warning myself. Because of the two of us, only I still believed in remaining. She reached out to me months later. I was already with someone else. Someone who listened to me. Who looked at me? Who respected me? Who made me feel whole again, without having to reinvent myself? And when my ex arrived saying she still loved me, that she couldn't sleep, that she couldn't move on, I offered her what was left in me, forgiveness. But not to start over. Forgiveness was my liberation. It was my final point. There was no more room for us. Because her love cost me too much, and I paid the price alone for a long time. She cried. A lot. She begged. She said she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. And maybe she had. Because that man she kissed at the party, the one she chose, didn't stay. He didn't keep any promises. He didn't build anything with her. He left before regret even set in. And, alone, she saw everything she'd destroyed, her partner, her home, her plans, her security. She saw what she lost when she traded me for an illusion. And that pain, that, yes, she would have to bear alone. The most surprising thing was what happened next. She showed up at my wedding. She wasn't invited, of course. She stood at the back of the church, behind a pillar. She thought no one would see her. But I saw her. For a second. And in that second, I realized, she wasn't there to cause trouble. She wasn't there to stop it. She was there to watch. To see what she'd lost taking definitive shape. Me exchanging vows with another woman. Me smiling again. Me looking at someone with the same dedication I once gave her. And her look was the final point of this story. It was the look of someone who understood there was no way back when you destroyed the trust of someone who only wanted to love in peace. She cried. She cried quietly. She left before the end. But I knew. Right then, I knew. Her regret was real. As real as the certainty there was no going back. She lost. And this time, forever. But what she doesn't know, what perhaps no one knows, is what happened the week before that kiss. A detail that changes everything. A decision I was about to make. A gesture that, if it had happened in time, might have prevented everything. But fate sometimes has its own plans, and doesn't always warn when it's going to change course. And that's where the Real story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, no type of betrayal is romanticized or encouraged. On the contrary, our stories profoundly demonstrate how infidelity destroys not only relationships, but also dignity, trust, and true love. All narratives are fiction, but based on real feelings and situations, to make you reflect and feel each choice, each consequence. Get ready now to dive into a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Press play, and may the truth hurt where it needs to hurt. High atop a glass and concrete building, with a panoramic view of the city's beating heart, lived a couple who seemed to have found, amidst the daily chaos, a rare kind of peace. They weren't perfect, nor did they try to appear so. But there was a silent connection between them, the kind that doesn't need to be announced in public or reaffirmed every moment. A look, a small gesture, a brief absence was enough for the other to notice, feel, and be there. His name was Daniel, a man who carried within him a kind of calm that was disarming. He wasn't the expansive type, nor did he make a point of shining in crowded places. He was discreet, observant, gentle with details, and possessed a quiet strength that revealed itself in the little things, in the way he listened without interrupting, in his care for other people's time, in his patience in dealing with the world's flaws. He had worked for years to build a stable life, and when he found Isabella, he felt he finally had something more valuable than any achievement, an emotional home. Isabella was different. She had a unique light, a restless, vibrant way, eyes that seemed to be searching for something even when she claimed to be at peace. She was always in a hurry, to live, to resolve, to feel. She was passionate about art, long conversations, and the idea of being loved intensely. When she met Daniel, it wasn't exactly love at first sight, but a deep curiosity that arose and grew over time. She found his silence strange at first, thinking there was a certain coldness in his reserved manner. But gradually she came to understand that, in that silence, there was a rare kind of listening, a complete presence. He didn't interrupt her. He looked at her deeply, as if wanting to understand what lay behind every sentence, every expression. And that, for Isabella, who had spent much of her life surrounded by superficialities, was like a breath of fresh air. Their relationship was built slowly, with bricks of respect, conversations about fears and old memories, good days and hard days. They lived in a spacious apartment decorated with a mix of both their tastes, abstract paintings that Isabella loved and rustic wood pieces chosen by Daniel on trips he'd taken alone before meeting her. To outsiders, they were the ideal couple. Friends commented on how they complemented each other, how her energy illuminated his introspection and how his calmness brought balance to her intensity. But what no one saw was that, even in the best stories, there are subterranean layers that grow silently. And sometimes, it's these layers that begin to crack what seemed solid. In the early years, Isabella was enchanted. Daniel's way of organizing books alphabetically, the handwritten notes he left around the house, the way he listened to her even when she talked about things he didn't understand, like contemporary art or interactive exhibits. He, in turn, found in her a freedom he'd never known. She gently pulled him off balance, made him try dishes he'd never eat, dance at parties until late, travel without a plan. They learned from each other, and this learning was what sustained their love. But life takes its toll, and their days began to be filled with responsibilities that once seemed distant. Commitments, meetings, goals, deadlines. Spontaneity turned to planning, and romance became routine. There was still affection, but sometimes the silence between them stopped being comfortable and became uncomfortable. Isabella began to feel misunderstood. Daniel withdrew more and more when something distressed him, and this irritated her. She wanted him to be more direct, to fight, to talk, to provoke her. And he, on the other hand, didn't understand why love had to be so loud. There came a time when conversations began to slip away. What had once been discussed at dinner was now put off until later. And later never came. They still loved each other, but they were moving at different speeds. Isabella tried to rekindle what she felt had cooled. She bought tickets to plays, invited him on weekend getaways, proposed unusual dinners. Daniel accepted, sometimes with genuine joy, other times wearily. He didn't understand that urgency. She didn't understand that calm. What had once been admiration turned into frustration disguised as patience. And yet, they remained together. Because there was love, there was history, there was a bond. And there was, above all, the hope that it was just a phase. Close friends noticed a certain distance in their gestures. They commented, inside conversations, that the two seemed less present. But no one dared say anything. After all, they were there, still together, showing up at birthdays, dinners, and celebrations like any other couple. And the truth is, behind the smiles, there were attempts. Daniel, with his reserved manner, bought flowers on random dates, left notes on the fridge, prepared silent breakfasts. Isabella, with her intensity, tried to control herself so as not to demand so much, took a deep breath during arguments, remembered the good times with a kind of active nostalgia, as if she could go back to the beginning with willpower. But there was a growing restlessness in Isabella. An emptiness she couldn't name. And as much as she knew Daniel loved her, there was something inside her that screamed for a kind of connection she no longer felt. It wasn't that he had changed. He'd always been like this. But perhaps she had hoped that, over time, he would transform into the kind of man who spoke more, reacted more, was more jealous, more impulsive, more confrontational. And he, being who he was, loved silently, but he loved. And it also pained him to see that what had once been enough was now no longer enough. They began sleeping at different times. Waking up without kissing. Eating without discussing the day. Words became more matter-of-fact, touches more rare. There was still affection, but the fire that had once united them seemed dormant. And neither of them knew quite how to rekindle it. Daniel held out hope. He thought everything would settle down in time. That they were just tired, that all it took was time away from external pressures for everything to return to the way it had been. Isabella, however, was beginning to think that perhaps that kind of love was no longer enough for her. Even so, there was commitment. And commitment, for Daniel, was sacred. He believed that relationships are sustained by the daily choice to stay. Not out of obligation, but out of fidelity to the story you've built. He believed that love went through phases, and that the most beautiful thing was precisely to continue choosing someone even when the initial euphoria faded. Isabella tried to believe this too. But sometimes, when she was alone, she found herself imagining what it would be like if she'd made different choices. Not because she wanted to give up on Daniel, but because she wondered if there was something wrong with her for not feeling fully satisfied. It was during this period of silence and unspoken attempts that something began to shift. Not explosively, but like a subtle crack in an old wall. Invitations began to appear, which Isabella accepted alone. Events, parties, dinners with friends that Daniel, out of fatigue or disconnection, missed. And she, at first, would return home wanting to tell how it went, wanting to share. But seeing his indifference, even if calm, she fell silent. And this lack of sharing gradually created a space between them. A space where boredom, doubt, and perhaps, without either of them realizing it, an emotional distance difficult to reverse, could reside. Daniel, though discreet, noticed. But he didn't know how to react. He believed it was just a phase. That there was nothing wrong, just tiredness. But there were nights when he woke alone and felt something slipping through the cracks of time. Still, he didn't question it. Because he trusted her. He trusted what they'd built. He trusted their love. And it was precisely this trust that prevented him from seeing the signs clearly. Because when you love deeply, it's hard to accept that the other person might be on a different wavelength. And he preferred to believe what he felt rather than see what was right before his eyes. Isabella, for her part, was drowning in confusion. She knew Daniel was a good man. She knew he loved her, even without grand gestures. But she missed something she couldn't name. She felt the outside world offer possibilities to feel alive again. And this feeling, though confused, began to grow within her. And like all unresolved emotions, it began to manifest itself in small decisions, in almost imperceptible choices that, taken together, would ultimately change the course of their lives forever. And it all began there, in the silence of two hearts that still loved each other but no longer heard each other as clearly. And it was in this scenario, where love still existed but no longer sustained everything, that the real story began to unfold, with small gestures, stifled desires, and a feeling of longing that grew like a shadow in the late afternoon. The betrayal, when it arrived, wouldn't come like a bolt from the blue. It would come as a consequence. As a symptom of something neither of them had the courage to face before it was too late. And what happened after that, was anything but expected. Isabella started going out more often. At first, it was one-off events, get-togethers with friends, small gallery openings, dinners organized by colleagues from her artistic circle. Daniel didn't see a problem, and he'd never been the controlling type. He trusted her, the life they'd built together, and the love he believed still existed, even in silence. He liked the idea that she felt alive amidst the art, the movement, the lights. And as much as he sometimes missed the time when she preferred to spend her evenings at home, between old movies and cheap wine, he understood that people change, that they need space, air, breaks. But there was something different. Not about Isabella, but in the way she fell silent after each outing. Before, she'd come back recounting details, joking about the conversations, showing photos, sharing impressions. Now, she returned quieter, with short answers, eyes that averted when he tried to grasp something beyond words. Daniel didn't want to press. He thought maybe she was tired, or just trying to rediscover herself. But something inside him was starting to throb. A kind of restlessness he couldn't quite put his finger on. The nights grew long. And silent. She spent hours on her phone, typing with restrained smiles, other times completely absorbed. She said they were conversations with friends in the art world, that she was trying to organize a new exhibition. He believed her, or at least tried. But there were times when he found himself looking at her, wondering if she was still the only one. Not physically, but emotionally. That space that had once been his alone and now seemed occupied by something or someone he couldn't name. There was no proof. There was no evidence. Just a dull feeling, growing silently, which he avoided feeding with questions. Isabella, on the other hand, was lost in internal contradictions. He knew what he was doing was a fine line. There was someone else. A recent presence, emerging amid these nocturnal events, that stirred her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. It was the kind of quick, flammable connection, full of looks that said more than words. I wasn't sure when it began, or if it began as intention. But the fact is, it was there. And she couldn't hold it back. At first, she thought it was just neediness, just vanity. She wanted to feel that she was still desired, that she still made an impact, that she still elicited the kind of attention that, over time, Daniel no longer offered. But the truth is, even she no longer knew if the problem was his absence or the excess of doubts within herself. The messages became more frequent. They began meeting outside of events. Small coffees, long conversations in discreet places. And the line was crossed. Not planned, not scripted, but like a fall. A silent choice, pushed by months of accumulated frustrations. She tried to convince herself it was an isolated incident, that she could control it. That she loved Daniel and that it was nothing more than a momentary emotional escape. But the problem with leaks is that, when they become recurrent, they stop being leaks and become a dwelling. And Isabella, little by little, began to build a parallel routine, made up of brief encounters, lies disguised as commitments, and feelings she herself couldn't explain. Daniel noticed the change, but didn't want to see it clearly. He preferred to believe it was just a phase, that she was stressed, that her work was too demanding. He started preparing more elaborate dinners, writing loving messages throughout the day, making himself more present. Isabella thanked him, but with a disconnected smile. She could no longer be her whole self there. Guilt grew within her, but it was always accompanied by justifications. She told herself that Daniel had also distanced himself. That his silence hurt too. That she was just looking for something resembling life. But deep down, she knew she was betraying more than a man. She was betraying history, her home, the years built on layers of complicity. It was one of those days, when Daniel was waiting for her for dinner and she didn't return, that he decided to go where he knew she would be. He'd been invited to an event organized by an artists' collective, one of those invitations he usually declined because he knew Isabella preferred to go alone. But this time, something inside him pushed him out of his comfort zone. He dressed carefully, grabbed his car keys, and left without warning. Arriving at the venue, he noticed a strange atmosphere. People who knew him looked at him in surprise, others averted their eyes. There were forced smiles, hurried greetings. And then he saw it. In the middle of the room, amid dim lights and low music, she was there. Laughing. With someone else. The laughter that was his now flowed to someone who wasn't part of that story. And in the next instant, he saw the kiss. It wasn't discreet. It wasn't hidden. It was natural, intimate, as if it were already part of their routine. The room spun. The music faded. And time froze in that second when everything inside him shattered. Daniel didn't make a scene. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. He just stared at her. For a second. Long, intense. She saw him. And in that look, everything was said. The past, the present, what would never be again. He turned and walked away. He walked past the people without saying anything, his eyes fixed on a random point. As he left, he simply muttered something that wasn't meant for her, or for the others. It was meant for himself. A warning. A sentence. Take good care of what's left, because there's nothing left of us. Isabella tried to chase him. She left the event in a hurry, texted, and tried to call. But Daniel didn't answer. She returned home and couldn't find him. The apartment was tidy, untouched, but it seemed empty of something essential. The next day, he returned. Calm. Serious. And he said, with a calmness that hurt more than any shout, that he needed time. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for explanations. He said that from then on, everyone would mind their own business. She tried to talk, tried to justify herself. But he wouldn't listen. The following days were confusing. Isabella was torn apart inside, but still tried to convince herself that things could be fixed. The other man, the one she'd crossed the line with, began to pull away. He claimed he'd never promised anything, that she was confused, that she didn't want to get involved. Isabella found herself, for the first time, completely alone. And it was in this silence that she began to understand what she'd lost. Not just Daniel. But everything he represented. The peace. The gaze that welcomed her even on difficult days. The love that weathered the storms. The silent loyalty of someone who chose to stay even when it would have been easier to walk away. Daniel, for his part, faced the pain with dignity. Immersed in memories, yes. In doubts, in sleepless nights. But firm in his decision not to return to what hurt him. He knew that forgiveness was possible. But forgetting was not. And he also knew that respect, once broken, transforms love into something else. There was sadness in his every gesture, but also a new serenity. As if, in losing everything, he had found himself again. But what Isabella didn't yet know, what Daniel never told her, was that in the week leading up to that kiss, that moment that destroyed everything, he had made a decision that would forever change the course of history. Something she never imagined. A gesture, a choice, a revelation about to come to light. And when that secret is revealed, nothing will ever be the same again. Isabella arrived at the apartment without knowing exactly what she expected to find. Daniel had accepted the meeting with a coldness she didn't recognize, as if he'd turned off an internal switch and now operated solely out of duty, formality, a need to definitively end what remained between them. She sat on the sofa with trembling hands, her gaze lost, her heart clenched by a guilt that now ached in a way she could no longer hide. He entered the room with firm steps, but the silence between them was dense, heavy with memories and absences. His eyes were different. There was no anger, no contempt, no exposed pain. There was something harder, acceptance. That acceptance that comes when the soul tires of fighting for something that no longer holds, and all that remains is dignity. Isabella tried to begin with an apology, but he calmly raised his hand, asking for silence. He said he'd heard enough. That she'd already said she regretted it. That it was a mistake. That she was confused. He'd heard it all before. And hearing it again wouldn't make any difference. She insisted, saying she had something to add, that it wasn't just about the betrayal. That, in the last few days, everything in her had been begging for another chance. That she'd seen, with her own eyes, the enormity of the loss. Daniel remained standing, staring out the window, and said quietly that what she saw now, he'd been feeling for a long time, but that he'd chosen silence because he still believed that love was also about bearing. But love, when it turns into solitary suffering, dies in silence. Isabella wept, and each tear was a muffled cry of regret he could no longer hold back. Daniel then turned, looked her in the eye with a firmness she had never seen before, and said that now it was his turn to speak. That there was something that had never been said. Something he had kept to himself, not out of cowardice, but because he wanted the moment to be perfect. He said that a week before the party, he had bought 2 tickets to Italy, booked a hotel in Florence, and chosen a restaurant on the banks of the Arno where, on that very trip, he planned to ask them to renew their wedding vows. He took a crumpled envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. Inside were the travel papers, the name of the hotel, the the restaurant reservation, and a small blue velvet case containing 2 new, simple, delicate wedding rings, inscribed, "Choosing you again, every day." Isabella held her breath. She opened the case with trembling fingers and, seeing the rings, collapsed to her knees. That gesture, that plan, that intention, all of it hit her harder than 1,000 accusations. Because in that moment, she understood that, while she was lost in doubts and vanity, he was silently dedicating himself to winning back something he had never stopped loving. She begged for forgiveness. She said she didn't know, that she never imagined. That if she had seen it before, she never would have, but Daniel interrupted. He said he didn't want her to blame herself for what could have been. What was done was done. And that he had already forgiven her, but not to start over. Forgiveness was his way of not letting resentment turn him bitter. But forgiveness isn't an invitation. It's not a return. It's a full stop. And he needed it to move on. She tried to tell him she still loved him, that now she was certain. That everything she'd experienced with the other man was nothing more than noise, emotional confusion. That no gesture from that other man could compare to the lightness of sharing silence with Daniel, the peace of knowing she was loved even on the days when she couldn't love herself. But her words, however sincere they were now, no longer had the power to rebuild what had been broken. Daniel, his eyes filled with serene sadness, replied that love cannot be found again when one chooses to destroy it at the moment when it most needed protecting. He sat on the sofa with his hands clasped, took a deep breath, and said he'd spent days rereading old letters, listening to old audio recordings, reviewing photos. He tried to find some place where he'd failed irreversibly. He tried to understand where he'd stopped being enough. And the most painful thing was realizing there was no glaring error. He'd been himself all along. With his limitations, his stillness, his particular way of loving. But that was precisely what she hadn't appreciated. She'd wanted more, when he'd already given her everything he could. And what she'd sought outside, he was trying to offer more deeply, only she hadn't waited. And now it was too late. Isabella trembled. She felt the weight of every word. She knew it wasn't a speech of revenge. It was simply the raw truth, stripped of any romanticization. She asked for one last chance. Not to return to the past, but to build something new. She said she could learn to listen, to respect, to appreciate the little things. She said she now saw the grandeur of what he did in silence, and that she was willing to rebuild everything, even if it took years. But Daniel responded with a sentence that stuck in her like a knife. The problem, Isabella, is that love can only be rebuilt by those who didn't destroy it. And I didn't destroy it. You destroyed it alone. And now, I'm the one who doesn't want it anymore. She stood up slowly. He looked at the case one last time and put it back in the envelope. You said you understood. It hurt more than anything you'd ever felt, but you understood. That he was right. And that if I ever had the chance to go back in time, I wouldn't do anything differently. Not to have another chance, but to never have lost what I only now knew the value of. Daniel just nodded. There was nothing more to say. The silence was no longer empty. It was closure. That night, she left the apartment with shuffling steps, as if carrying the weight of a funeral. And, in a way, it was. A symbolic funeral for everything they could have been. Daniel stood there for a few moments, breathing deeply, looking at the tickets for the trip that would never happen. Then he got up, calmly gathered everything, put the pencil case in the bottom drawer of the closet, and turned out the lights. But fate, which had already made its first move, still had one last piece in store. A coincidence that was no coincidence. An unexpected presence. Something that would emerge in the next action and show that, even when all seems lost, life is still capable of surprising. Because the void left by Isabella was about to be filled by something she never imagined. And while she began to understand the true price of her choices, Daniel was about to discover that love, when true, cannot be repeated, but can be reborn elsewhere. In another gaze. In another soul. And that would change everything. The weeks that followed were a kind of silent resurrection for Daniel. He didn't seek to understand, much less discuss, the past. He didn't dwell on the details of the fall, he didn't replay scenes, he didn't relive conversations. He just kept going. Not out of force or coldness, but because he understood there was something liberating in no longer insisting on something that wouldn't embrace him back. The pain that had burned in the early days was now just a discreet ember, still warm but controlled. He went back to walking in the mornings, listening to his favorite songs without the taste of each verse bringing back painful memories. He began accepting previously ignored invitations, reconnecting with old friends, and even allowing himself to smile more occasionally, not as an escape, but as a small return to his own skin. It was at one of these unpretentious gatherings, organized by a childhood friend, that he met Helena. She arrived late, with her hair tied up haphazardly and a rush that contrasted with the lightness in her eyes. She had a way of observing before speaking, and when she did speak, she spoke with depth. It wasn't long before they exchanged long glances, then smiles, then words. They talked for hours that night. About books, travels, failures. About silences. She had gone through a divorce 2 years earlier, and her face bore not sorrow, but subtle scars that only those who have survived the end of something true can carry with dignity. Daniel didn't mention Isabella. Helena didn't ask. And perhaps that was what brought them together, the absence of pressure, of expectation, of urgency. It was like walking through a minefield with the ease of someone who has defused so many bombs that they now know exactly where to step. The encounters continued. Little by little. No promises. Just presence. Helena laughed easily and asked profound questions. There was a peace in her way of being that reminded Daniel of a forgotten version of himself. She didn't demand, she didn't press. She simply walked alongside. One day, sitting on a park bench after coffee, she said, with the simplicity of someone who doesn't dramatize feelings, "You have a way of listening that makes silence seem like a conversation." Daniel laughed in surprise. It was the first time in a long time that someone had seen him completely, without asking him to change to fit another kind of love. Meanwhile, Isabella lost herself in an empty routine. The other man had completely disappeared, blocking her in every possible way. Mutual friends began to drift away without explanation. She began receiving fewer and fewer invitations to the events that once filled her nights. The city began to feel too small for so many memories. She tried to go back to painting, to writing, to finding herself, but everything felt interrupted. Guilt gnawed at her more intensely than she could show. It wasn't just for betraying Daniel. It was for betraying herself, her own promises, her own truths. One day, without planning, she came across Daniel and Helena walking hand in hand, smiling, talking complicitly. It wasn't a theatrical scene. There was no ostentation, no revenge. Just two bodies that seemed to belong together. Isabella froze for a second. Daniel saw her, recognized her gaze, and simply gave a slight nod. A polite but distant nod. That hit her harder than any words. Because, in that second, she understood that he wasn't trying to put on a good show, he was well. Really. No masks. And the worst part wasn't seeing him with someone else. It was knowing that he had rediscovered exactly what, for some reason, she believed no longer existed between them. Later that week, Isabella decided to write a letter. Not to ask for his return. Not to change what could no longer be changed. But because she needed to get something out of her system. She handed him the letter, asking him to read it slowly. Daniel accepted. He waited 2 days until he was ready. He sat alone on his porch, hot tea in hand, the silence his companion. The letter began with an apology but soon turned into a raw outburst. She spoke of the internal pressures, the holes she tried to fill with noise, the fear of being invisible. She admitted that, at some point, she stopped seeing his love because she was blinded by her own needs. She confessed that she had never found in anyone else what she found in the way he cared for the things that seemed small but were everything. She said, "You were never little. I was the one who was too much of everything I didn't need to be. And too little of what you deserved." In the end, she asked only that he remember her fondly, if possible. And he said, "I lost you long before you left. And yet, you still let me go with more love than I deserved." Daniel closed the letter slowly. He took a deep breath. For a moment, he let the memory of the Isabella he loved pass through his mind like a light breeze. There was no more pain. No more resentment. Just an old feeling that now seemed to belong to another time. He put the letter in a box along with old photos, tickets from past trips, and the tickets to Florence that had never been used. It wasn't an altar to suffering. It was a kind of intimate museum. A place he knew he never needed to return to, but which held the importance of what made him who he was now. A few days later, Isabella sought him out again. She said she didn't want to disturb him, that she wasn't there to relive anything. She simply wanted to return something she'd found by chance, an old sketchbook of his, which was among her books. She handed it to him carefully, and before leaving, she said, "Life has returned you in peace. And that, Daniel, is the greatest punishment I could receive. Because now I know that my absence is exactly what freed you." He thanked her sincerely. He said he hoped she would someday find the same kind of peace. She nodded, her eyes brimming, and left. It was the final goodbye. Not just to the relationship, but to the guilt, the attachment, the cycle. Daniel returned home that night to find Helena preparing something simple in the kitchen. When she saw him enter, she smiled with a gleam in her eyes that asked for no guarantees. He hugged her from behind, rested his face on her shoulder, and remained there, silent. "I didn't need to say anything." The peace Isabella had mentioned was real. But it wasn't just about being with someone new. It was about finally being whole with someone who saw him without asking him to stop being who he'd always been. The past no longer defined him. It was just a closed chapter in a book that was now taking a different path. At the end of that week, Daniel and Helena traveled together. Not to Italy, as he had planned with Isabella, but to a place he had never been with anyone. A new place, for a new story. During a walk by the sea, Helena asked, without any pressure, "Do you still miss her?" Daniel paused for a moment, looked at the horizon, and calmly replied, "I miss who she was when she loved me. But today, what I have with you is what I've always sought, love with peace, with presence, with truth. This doesn't give me room to miss what hurt me." She smiled. She said nothing. She just held his hand tighter. And so, between new pages, simple gestures, and a rare kind of serene love, Daniel moved on. The pain had passed, the disappointment healed, and forgiveness had fulfilled its purpose. He no longer needed promises, nor forced new beginnings. He had what he'd sought for years, someone he chose to be with, even when the world demanded haste. And that, for someone who has known the taste of betrayal, is the kind of love that cannot be negotiated. It's the kind of love that, when it arrives, doesn't hurt. It heals. The days that followed Daniel and Isabella's final conversation were not filled with euphoria, nor with any sense of victory or justice. They were silent days, marked by a mature calm, a serenity born not of indifference, but of the awareness that everything that needed to be said had already been said, and that there was nothing left to prove, either by him or her. Daniel went about his daily life with ease, but without haste. Life no longer demanded immediate answers, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to live without the anxiety of resolving, repairing, or rebuilding. He had accepted that certain relationships don't break in a single moment, but slowly crumble through repeated choices, through long silences, through absences disguised as presence. And when they finally break, what remains is not the desire for revenge or return, but the understanding that moving forward is the only dignified path. His relationship with Helena evolved with the naturalness of encounters born not of necessity, but of continuous choice. There was a growing intimacy between them that required neither exaggerated displays nor grandiose promises. They knew where they were standing because each step was built with honesty. Daniel learned, day after day, that a healthy relationship isn't one that sweeps you off your feet, but one that teaches you to walk firmly, lightly, and carefully. Helena had a delicate way of not invading his past, but at the same time acknowledging its existence, and this maturity allowed Daniel to open up without fear. For the first time, he felt he didn't need to be more than he was, nor hide the parts still healing. And because of that, he could be whole. Isabella, for her part, sank into a different kind of silence. A silence that no longer screamed regret, but carried with it the weight of knowing she had crossed a line that would never be erased. She spent hours staring at the empty spaces of the apartment, remembering small things that once seemed inconsequential, the way he arranged the cushions before lying down on the sofa, the silent ritual of breakfast, the way he watched her when she talked about art even though she didn't fully understand it. It wasn't the grand moments that haunted her now, but the details. Because it's the details that sustain a life together, and that was exactly what she missed. She tried to move on, as many had advised. She tried to fill her time with work, with courses, with new people. But it all seemed too superficial, too fleeting, too cold. And the cruelest part was knowing that it wasn't about not finding anyone worthy of Daniel, but about recognizing that, deep down, she herself was no longer the person he deserved by her side. And that truth hurt in a way that no tears could fully express. One afternoon, while organizing her old things, Isabella found a notebook of unfinished sketches. Among the pages was a self-portrait she had made during one of the calmer phases of their relationship. Her features were light, her eyes more lively, there was something in that drawing that seemed no longer present in her current expression. She stood there, still, observing her own image as if staring at a stranger. That woman in the paper was someone who believed she was loved, and more than that, someone who knew how to love in return. Isabella didn't cry. She simply closed the notebook and put it in a box, as if accepting that some versions of herself die along with certain choices. The pain was now silent, but carried the strange dignity of someone who learned from their mistakes without looking for external blame. She no longer blamed Daniel for leaving. In fact, she began to admire his courage. Because, in the end, leaving is also an act of love, self-love. Meanwhile, Daniel's relationship with Helena was taking on new forms. There was no rush to label things, but there was a growing consistency. Simple dinners at home, unpretentious outings, conversations that flowed without barriers. Helena had the wisdom of someone who has fallen and gotten back up, and this made her presence comforting. Daniel, in turn, was beginning to discover a kind of quiet joy, a happiness that doesn't announce itself, but is felt in the gaps of everyday life. He began writing again, something he hadn't done since before his marriage to Isabella. Loose texts, aimless, but filled with truth. Writing was like returning to himself. It was like gathering the remaining parts and rearranging them in a new way, without resentment, without haste, without urgency. A dilemma began to form within him, subtly but inevitably. Helen loved him. He also felt a growing love for her, but there was still something inside him that begged his attention, the memory of an old love that, though ended, still lived within him somewhere. Not as a desire for return, but as a scar that sometimes throbs. Daniel wondered if it was fair to move on with someone as pure as Helena while still carrying fragments of an unresolved grief. But it was one night, when he shared this with her, that he understood how truly he was in the right place. Helena listened to him in silence. And then she said, with gentle firmness, "I don't want to heal you of anything, Daniel. I don't need you to be clean of the past to be with me. I just need you to be true to me now. The scars are part of it. I have mine too. And maybe we're never completely ready, but when there's respect and choice, love blossoms all the same." He didn't answer immediately. He just held her hand tightly. It was as if those words had stitched something inside him that was still loose. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about integrating it into the present with honesty. And there, in that simple gesture, Daniel knew he was loving again, with maturity, with lucidity, with surrender. Isabella, for her part, made a silent decision. Without sending messages, without making a fuss, she began to distance herself from everything that directly reminded her of Daniel. She changed her address, her cell phone number, and started over in a different space, with different references. Not to escape, but out of respect. He knew that any attempt to stay close would be a way of clinging to something that no longer belonged to him. And, more than that, he understood that true redemption doesn't come when others forgive us, but when we are capable of changing even knowing no one else is watching. Life went on. Daniel and Helena began planning a trip together. A simple destination, nothing overtly symbolic. Just the desire to be together, far from it all, free from the burdens of the past. Isabella immersed herself in social projects, rediscovered an old calling for teaching, and began giving art classes to children. Her face still carried shadows, but now there was a soft, discreet light, like someone who had learned to walk in the dark and understood that guilt can transform into learning if not fueled by pride. The story between Daniel and Isabella had no romantic reunion, no forced reconciliation. It had closure. It had recognition. He had a definitive but dignified goodbye. And the moral dilemma that remains, the mark that lingers, is this: how far does forgiveness go? And can love, when it's true, survive disloyalty? The answer perhaps lies precisely in how each of them chose to move forward, not as victim or villain, but as flawed human beings who, at some point, lost each other and themselves. The greatest impact came not from the betrayal itself, but from the belated realization that what was broken could no longer be rebuilt. And yet, life went on. With new loves, with new paths, with the weight of what was lost and the lightness of what could be saved. But even with all the reconstruction, there was something that still needed to happen. Something that, though seemingly resolved, still pulsed silently. One last choice. One last gesture. One last encounter. Because some stories, even after the full stop, still have a comma that insists on being written. And that comma was about to emerge unexpectedly, like a whisper of fate, about to become a word. Helena arrived at the apartment shortly after 6, carrying a white wine in her bag and a faint scent of lavender. Daniel was waiting for her in the kitchen, chopping ingredients for a simple dinner, the kind that doesn't require elaborate recipes but carries meaning beneath the surface. The week had been particularly intense, not because of anything specific, but because of a subtle accumulation of sensations and memories that, no matter how much he tried, he still couldn't completely erase. It wasn't pain, it wasn't longing, it was something else, a remnant of the past that manifests itself in long silences, in thoughts that linger beyond what's necessary, in questions that don't need answers but arise nonetheless. Helena sensed this upon entering, but didn't say anything immediately. She simply took off her shoes, walked over to him, and rested her chin on his shoulder, watching him slice tomatoes with almost meditative precision. Daniel paused for a moment, touched her hand resting on his waist, and said, without turning his face, "I think I need to talk to you about something I haven't finished with." Helena didn't move. There was no tension in her body. No flinching. She simply said, "Speak. I'm here." Daniel dried his hands, turned off the stove, and pulled out a chair. They sat face to face, without the rush typical of difficult conversations. He took a deep breath, searching for words that wouldn't hurt, but that were honest. "I feel like my story with Isabella is over. That I've closed the door on what we were. But sometimes, when something moves me, when I see a place that reminds me of something, I'm still touched by it all. I don't want you to think there's room for her here," he said, pointing to his chest, "but I also don't want to hide from you that I'm still dealing with those memories." Helena kept her eyes fixed on his, and her answer came with unexpected serenity. "It's not about not feeling, Daniel. It's about what you do with what you still feel. I've been there. I also loved someone who hurt me. And I needed time to transform all of that into learning. You don't owe me perfection. You owe me presence. And that's what you've given me." He lowered his head for a moment, touched by a compassion he'd rarely experienced in his life. The woman before him not only understood him, but embraced even what he didn't know how to handle. And that maturity disarmed him more than any forced romanticism. They changed the subject easily. Dinner passed amid laughter, childhood memories, and plans for a weekend out of town. But something had clicked between them. A space of trust was created there, in that calm dialogue, and this further strengthened the bonds that had been patiently forged. Meanwhile, Isabella was going through a quieter process of rebuilding. Her new address was modest, in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and with a small balcony where she spent much of her mornings drawing. Life now had a different rhythm. More introspective, more reflective. She had distanced herself from the social circle she had once frequented so often, and this separation didn't cause her pain. On the contrary, it was as if she had finally found a version of herself that didn't depend on the approval of others to exist. Her days were filled with classes, books, and brief encounters with new people who knew her not for who she had been, but for who she was there, in the present, with her fragilities and truths exposed. It was one of those mornings, while organizing a workshop for a group of teenagers, that Isabella received an unexpected message. It was from Daniel's mother. A woman who had always been sweet to her, even after the end of their relationship. The message was simple: "I'm organizing a small birthday dinner. I'd like to invite you. You were an important part of our history, and I know my son has already moved on, but if you feel like coming, you're welcome." Isabella took minutes to process it. She hadn't expected it. She didn't know what to respond. Daniel's mother had always treated her with genuine affection, but she imagined that, after all, the bridge had been burned. The message touched her deeply. Not because of the possibility of reunion, but because of the way it acknowledged the past with respect, without contempt. She decided not to respond right away. She needed to think. On the other side, Daniel had also been informed about the dinner. He knew it would be an intimate affair, with few people. He said he would bring Helena, and his mother, with the same affection as always, simply nodded. She didn't comment. She knew everyone now had their place. On the night of the dinner, the atmosphere was welcoming, with warm lighting and soft music in the background. Daniel arrived with Helena and, as usual, was greeted with hugs, toasts, and smiles. They were at ease, but something in the atmosphere changed when the doorbell rang and Isabella entered. Daniel's mother greeted her with a tight, wordless hug. Those present were surprised, but no one dared to break the mood with questions or judgments. There was something respectful in everyone's gesture, as if they understood that a story deserved to be examined with humanity. Isabella avoided approaching Daniel. She greeted him with a slight wave and kept her distance, chatting with the other guests, smiling when necessary, but with a look that revealed a mix of nostalgia and acceptance. Daniel watched her discreetly. There was no discomfort, but neither was the thread that once connected them. It was like rediscovering an old photograph. You know you've been there, but you know, with equal clarity, that you no longer belong to that time. Helena noticed his gaze, but showed no jealousy. She simply held his hand gently, as if to reassure him that she is there, with him, in the present. Later, late in the evening, when most of the guests had left, Isabella approached Daniel in the garden. He was alone, staring at the lights of the house, taking a last sip of wine. She approached cautiously and said in a low voice, "It was good to see you well." "Truly." Daniel looked at her and replied, "And it was good to see you at peace." Isabella smiled, her eyes filling with tears. "You found someone who understands you. That's rare. I hope you know that." Daniel nodded. "I know. And I hope you find it too. But before that, may you find everything you've stopped searching for within yourself." Isabella took a deep breath. "Life will teach me, as it has. Thank you for everything. For loving when you could. For leaving when you were needed. You taught me more than I was able to understand at the time." He didn't answer. He just smiled. That was enough. There was nothing more to say. That night, as they said goodbye, each carried a piece of the past with a new layer of maturity. Not as someone brooding, but as someone who had learned. And while Isabella returned home alone, without sadness, but with a sweet weight of memory, Daniel drove beside Helena, with a peace that required no justification. No words were exchanged during the journey. The comfortable silence between two bodies who knew, with conviction, they were in the right place was enough. The dilemma now was different. How to continue loving truly after being hurt? How to open the doors of the soul again without allowing the past to contaminate the present? Daniel didn't know the complete answers, but he knew where he wanted to be. And that, for someone who had already been shattered inside, was a silent and profound victory. The end of a story isn't always the end of love. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of a more conscious, more whole, more human love. And as contradictory as it may seem, it was pain that taught him the true value of peace. And this peace still held one final gesture, one final outcome, one that no one there could have foreseen, but that would change everyone's lives forever. A few months after that dinner, Daniel and Helena faced a new reality. A trip planned without great expectations became the milestone of a transition even more profound than any he had ever experienced. It was as if each step away from his old home also represented a definitive emotional separation from everything he had once been, and now, in the presence of someone who didn't demand that he be different from who he was, love was reborn in a different form, gentler, more conscious, but, above all, true. During that trip, in a small seaside inn, unhurriedly, without fanfare, Helena handed him a small envelope. Inside, a note with few words, but which changed everything. If you want, we can build together from now on. My way. Your way. Ours. And beside it, 2 sets of keys, one to her house and one to the new one they were about to choose. Daniel looked at her with moist eyes, held her hand tightly, and simply said, yes. It wasn't a proposal. It was a meeting. There was no ceremony, no party. But there was a surrender. And that, for him, was more than enough. The new home was built little by little. Paintings chosen at fairs, repurposed furniture, books stacked haphazardly but with affection. There was room for everything, except the past that had taught her nothing. Helena understood that some memories would still surface, but they weren't threats. They were like shadows from a night that had already passed. And Daniel, increasingly, felt whole. He wrote more. He took photographs. He walked in the mornings with a light heart. He had finally found what he had been searching for all along, someone with whom he could be, just be. And in that being, love peacefully. Isabella, in another corner of the city, continued her discreet path. Her art classes began to grow. Children and teenagers came to her not only for her technique, but for the way she conducted the meetings, always listening, always sensitive. She now had a greater understanding of the timing of things, the value of pauses, the importance of not trying to control what has already slipped out of hand. She began to be invited to lectures and small exhibitions, but she was no longer dazzled. Recognition was now a consequence, not a necessity. One day, while finalizing the curation of a new exhibition, she received a call that paralyzed her for a few seconds. It was from the old friend with whom her lover had betrayed her, a voice she hadn't heard in a long time. The woman said, in a neutral tone, I just wanted you to know that he did to me what he did to you. He used, discarded, and erased. I'm not calling you out of revenge, but because it took me a while to understand that we were just stepping stones. Isabella remained silent. The voice on the other end dropped like a stone into the serene lake she tried to maintain. Not out of pain, not out of longing. But because it confirmed that she'd allowed herself to be deceived by someone who never intended to stay. She thanked him for the call and, upon hanging up, stood there, staring at the unfinished painting on the wall. She picked up her brushes and decided to transform that final pain into art. Not to keep, but to purge. Weeks later, the exhibition opened. Among the abstract paintings and intense tones, one in particular caught everyone's attention. It was a panel divided into two parts, one with hard lines, dark colors, and dense overlapping layers, the other, cleaner, with soft brushstrokes and deliberate white spaces. In the bottom corner, a phrase written in small letters read, "A mistake doesn't define who you are, but what you do after it does." The audience was moved, many identified with it, and Isabella, without naming names, transformed her story into expression. She no longer needed to be forgiven by anyone. She had already forgiven herself. But she knew that didn't erase what she had caused. She would carry that scar with awareness, without victimization, but also without denial. Daniel learned about the exhibition by chance. He saw the article in a magazine and recognized the name, the signature, the style. He considered going, but decided against it. Not out of resentment, but because he understood that there are stories that, even when scarred, no longer need to be revisited. He sent a short message, "I saw your exhibition. Congratulations. May you continue to find beauty in everything you touch." She responded with a thank you emoji and a simple, "I wish you the same." It was the last exchange between them. No longing, no resentment. Just respect. A silent but honest finale. That same day, Helena watched Daniel organizing books on the shelf. He seemed calm and focused, but when she saw his cell phone resting on the table, she asked, "Everything okay?" He replied with a slight smile, "The story that needed to end is truly over now." Then he leaned closer, cupped her face in his hands, and said, "The best chapter began when I met you. I just had to close the previous one properly." She didn't ask for an explanation. She simply kissed him. That was enough. The following month, Daniel was invited to speak at an event on literature and emotional reconstruction. His deeply personal text addressed love, loyalty, choices, and loss. And at the end, he said, "Sometimes, the love of your life will be the person you let go. And other times, the love of your life will be the one who arrives when you're no longer looking, but still believe." The audience gave a standing ovation. And in that moment, Daniel understood that the pain he'd experienced was not in vain. It had shaped him. And more than that, it had prepared him to experience something more authentic. Isabella, in turn, was invited to coordinate an art therapy project with victims of abusive relationships. She accepted without hesitation. Now, her talent was no longer just expression and became healing. She no longer carried guilt as punishment, but as responsibility. She used her experience not to justify her mistakes, but to prevent others from making them or accepting them into their lives. She became an admired woman, not for her perfection, but for her courage to truly begin again. Their story didn't end as you'd expect from a romantic tale. There was no reunion, no return. But there was forgiveness. And more than that, there was transformation. Each of them followed their own path, not as separate halves, but as wholes who completed themselves. Love, in the end, isn't about keeping someone by your side at any cost. It's about allowing each person to find their own path, even if it means going in opposite directions. If you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to comment. What would you do if you were in Daniel's shoes? Would you be able to forgive, even knowing there's no turning back? Or would you let the past speak louder? Leave your opinion here in the comments, it's very important. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like if this story touched you in any way. May this narrative serve as a powerful reminder that betrayal destroys not only the other person, but also what is most precious within the betrayer. It slowly erodes trust, tears apart love, tarnishes peace, and often destroys something that can never be rebuilt. The consequences extend beyond the act, they spread like silent cracks in the soul of those who chose to stray. And finally, we reinforce, this channel does not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. The stories told here are fictional, but they carry emotional truths that show how much our choices can impact lives, including our own. May the reflection remain, may the learning endure, and may respect never be negotiable. Until the next story.